Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on which time zone you are in. Thank you so much for joining us. I hope everyone is in good health and high spirits during these extraordinary times. I am Dania Thafer. I'm the Executive Director at Gulf National Forum. It's my privilege to introduce this excellent panel on a very timely issue titled A Twofold Blow to the Gulf, OPEC Implosion and a Global Pandemic. I will begin by outlining the broad economic structures of the GCC states that will inform some of the key themes that will be up for discussion today. As the world enters into an uncertain phase, the economic ramifications of this random exogenous shock, namely the COVID-19 pandemic, is unmatched in swiftness and severity. Yet the adverse consequences are not equal across all economies, and hence the title of this event, which is a twofold blow, as a reference to the GCC states, was befitting for the current circumstances of their economies. The oil and gas demand destruction caused by the coronavirus pandemic, coupled with the ongoing price war, has wreaked havoc for the GCC economies. The last couple of weeks, we have witnessed crumbled oil prices to a level well below the budget break-evens for the GCC states. And why does that matter? Well, one, these economies are highly susceptible to price volatilities, and also they're highly dependent on hydrocarbons. And two, these economies are also highly exposed due to their endemic economic structures. First, the commonly discussed topic is the lack of diversification in these economies. And much of the diversification in these economies are vertical, with emphasis on different products such as petrochemicals or other petroleum-derived products, which are naturally pegged to the vulnerability of the oil and gas markets, consequently augmenting the negative effects on these economies. The more important diversification is horizontal diversification, as many of us know, which is the non-oil gas sector. And in the GCC states, it's primarily focused on industries such as hospitality, retail, and logistics. And as we know, these industries have been susceptible to significant losses and disadvantages in the corona economy. The GCC states simply do not have enough diversification in industries that are valuable in the corona economy, such as the digital economic sector. Second, structurally speaking, the uniquely high labor elasticity of Gulf economies may appear to be a competitive advantage for these states, at least. Yet it does have adverse consequences. Maintaining human capital, especially ones that contribute to diversification, is vital. And as the effect of the economic downturn causes labor to depart, then demand on consumer goods and real estate will likely drastically be downshifted, adding another repercussion to the coronavirus pandemic. Third, the GCC states lack mechanisms to stimulate the economies that exist in many conventional economies. One simple one is unemployment, especially for the expatriate workforce. And the other is what they call lack of automatic stabilizers, which allow them to inject stimulus into the economy, which is a policy feature that expands spending or reduce tax collection during economic downturns. And there is some flexibility with regards to the VAT taxes, and then there's some fees that they can defer or cancel for the business communities. but I mean, it's rather limited. So it is ostensible that the GCC states in this crisis will rely less on fiscal support and more heavily on credit and liquidity measures. There are three primary options in the policy toolbox that can mitigate the effect of this twofold blow and raise capital for the GCC states. First, I mean, simply they can gain access to the credit market, which is dependent on the capacity to borrow. And the problem with that is that, you know, as this crisis persists, the credit market has been downgrading some of the Gulf economies. And this is especially problematic for Bahrain and Oman from the 6 GCC states. Another option is to utilize fiscal buffers, such as sovereign wealth funds to hedge against the loss of these revenues. And the other is central banks provide liquidity to the financial system in order to stimulate the economy. And this has been a primary tool for the GCC states, among many states. And all states have included that in their stimulus packages. In light of these challenges, key questions arise. What are the main objectives of the current price war? Are they to remove competitors from the market, or for Saudi Arabia to avoid unilateral cuts in production, or both? In tomorrow's meeting, will Saudi Arabia and Russia strike a deal? If so, how viable will that deal be to restore prices and relieve GCC economies? And how does this affect US-GCC relations? How will GCC states raise sufficient capital to survive this economic crisis, especially those with substantial deficits that have limited fiscal buffers, depleting assets, and limited credit access? And how does the economic downturn affect their 2030 visions? Without further ado, I will introduce our speakers in order of their presentations. So Dr. Hani Findakly, he's the vice chairman of the Clinton Group. He has a long and distinguished career focused on investments, and he's worked both as a practitioner and in academia. Rachel Ziemba, she's the founder of Ziemba Insights, a macroeconomic and policy due diligence advisory firm, and she's also a non-resident fellow with us. And third will be Dr. Jean-François Seznec. He's a senior fellow at the Atlantic Council. He has over 25 years of experience in finance as both a scholar and a practitioner focused on the Gulf. And last, but certainly not least, Dr. Jasim Husain, who's a former member of the Bahraini Parliament, where he served on the Finance and Economic Committee. So each panelist will have about 10 minutes to speak, and then after that we will have the Q&A, and then 2 minutes for each panelist for the closing remarks. For everyone in the audience, all of our attendees, please write your questions in the chat. And it would be great if you could write them early on during the presentation. So while they're speaking, it will not disrupt us at all. And then I can sift through them and make sure to pose them to the panel. That would be a great help. Now I will pass the baton on to Dr. Hani Findakly, who will discuss how the oil price drop affects the GCC states as well as US-GCC relations. Dr. Findakly?
Thank you very much, and good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everybody. This is a novelty and tells you a little bit about how technology reshapes the way we do things, as it has been the case for the last 20 or 30 years, and probably will continue. And I suspect that this is not only an impact on GCC, but an impact on the entire world, the way we conduct meetings, the way we communicate, the way we do things. So I will address some of the questions that our capable moderator raised, but I probably am not in a good position to discuss the issues about Russia, Saudi Arabia, or Saudi Arabia, U.S. or GCC U.S. relationship. It is way beyond my my pay scale, as they say. So, in looking at this current crisis, I reflect on the fact that every crisis, whether internal or external, exposes the vulnerability of a country or an economy to both internal and or external shocks, and brings about some remedies, corrective remedies that the countries deal with. The last financial crisis we had in 2007, 2008 exposed the vulnerability of the Western financial and banking system and brought about changes in the system that are probably likely to be permanent and have prepared this system to withstand the shock that we are currently enduring, at least so far. For the GCC, that lesson was not learned properly. They learned about the vulnerability of the economies of the region to high dependence on oil prices. And to some extent, they learned about the dysfunctional economic system they had and tried in various ways to deal with issues of diversifying the economy and reducing the dependence on oil, and probably some modest reform on the social, economic, and labor force. Quite a bit of those measures, however, were well-intended, well-defined, but lacked the ability to execute and focused instead on artificial, what I call transactional steps to deal with that. Examples of that, of course, is the listing, the hyped-up listing of Aramco shares, the SABIC Aramco merger, the delisting, the more recent delisting of the Dubai ports from the London Stock Exchange. All of these were the Neom City project. All of those were for the show, and they did not really address the fundamental structural issues of the economies and the labor force of the region. The problem is that the economy itself is vulnerable to both internal and external shocks because of its inability to function in a competitive global environment. It lacks productivity, it lacks flexibility, and it is very cost ineffective. Worse, in dealing with the issues and the ramification of the prior crises, is that they try to address in an accounting manner the deficits, fiscal deficits that the government faced. And they did that in the most anti-Keynesian way that you would expect, and that is to raise taxes and fees and reduce subsidies just about the same time when the economies were suffering from slow growth and in many cases negative growth. So where do we stand right now? I'm going to use Saudi Arabia as an example for the interest of time, but it shares with many of the GCC countries, although there are some variations, many of the attributes that I will be describing. Saudi budget deficit currently is about $272 billion, and for the sake of those who are interested in numbers, in the last 15 years, Saudi budget always underestimated spending by a factor of between 7 and 20% per year, and overestimated revenues by about the same factor. So if you use 15 to 20% variation, it says that probably their spending in 2019 and expected spending in 2020 will likely be about 20% to 20% higher than stated, and revenues are a bit lower, so deficits are bigger than they had previously estimated. The current assumption of the Saudi budget is that they will have a revenue from oil prices based on Brent crude prices of about 65 US dollars. And Jean-François probably will be able to address those numbers more accurately than I can. But roughly about $160 billion of revenues from oil and about $20 to $25 billion of non-oil revenues. These include VAT taxes, some fees, reduced subsidies, and money that they get from from the Hajj and other tourist services, which roughly about 12 to 15 billion US dollars. That translated to a deficit of roughly $50 billion. My current estimate, based on current prices of crude and for the balance of this year, which I don't know what it will be, but I assume will be somewhere in the range of about 30 to 35 US dollars, will add about $100 billion to the budget deficit. Saudi Arabia today sits on foreign exchange reserves of about 450 billion US dollars. And so their ability to fund that gap will be a combination of what they have done in the past, which is one, to try to use the foreign exchange reserves to bring down the deficit by lowering it a bit. They have reduced it so far in the last 4 years from 750 billion to 450 billion. They do some external borrowing, and they do some domestic borrowing through local sukuks, and they usually stuff that with the commercial banks. This ability to continue to borrow and reduce foreign exchange reserves will probably last for the next 12 to 18 months, maybe the next 2 years. But it gets to a situation where they need to find some other remedies, which really translates into reduce spending quite a bit. And part of the reason is that I think the GDP, my estimates, preliminary estimate for 2020 will drop by about 15% in 2020. Quite a bit of that is going to depend on how long this crisis, coronavirus crisis, lasts, and whether it will recur into the fall. That will constrain the ability of the economy to grow. So where do we stand right now, and where are we headed? The moderator mentioned about all these measures, economic measures that the countries have to deal with deficits and to plug in any kind of spending to provide stimulus for the economy. One of the features of the region that limits the ability, you all know about the CARES package that Congress passed in a span of a few days to raise about $2 trillion, about 10% of US GDP. And now they're talking about possibly another measure of similar amount. So we could easily raise enough money to provide a cushion for the economy. That the Gulf states do not have that flexibility. And the reason why they don't have it is that their currency of the Gulf states are linked to the US dollar. So they don't have an infinite ability to print money the way the Federal Reserve can, or the way the Bank of England can, or the way the Bank of China can. They are very linked to the US dollar. And now they are facing one of two, what I call Hobbesian choices. One is to de-link from the dollar, either voluntarily or be forced into doing that, or to accept a far lower growth into their economy for the foreseeable future. One of the biggest problems that they face in the medium term is that they face a situation that lasted almost 30 years, from about 1980, mid-1980s, all the way into the early 2000s, where their real standard of living, real per capita income, declined by about 30% cumulatively over that 25-year period. And my fear is that they are going to face a very similar kind of situation in the foreseeable future, partly because of technology that's allowing the substitutes for hydrocarbon fuel, partly because of environmental issues, partly because probably a prospective economic downturn that could last quite a bit. If you read today's Financial Times, it shows that the United Nations International Labour Organization is forecasting a loss of about 195 to 200 million jobs worldwide, which is roughly about 7 to 8% of the global workforce. That results in continued decline in consumption. There's a number of other issues that I have in mind discussing, but I'd like to talk about it maybe in the questions and answer session. I will just address the one question about the Russia, Saudi Arabia oil spat, so to speak. And I find, from an economic standpoint, that their objective of maximizing market share is absolutely the right objective. If over the course of the next 20 or 30 years, hydrocarbon products will be less in demand, and more substitutes will come into being, and more economies and consumption will take place. Then, if you're an oil producer, you want to sell the maximum amount of oil as early as possible, and therefore maximizing market share and selling as much as you can at any price at this point, I think, is the right objective. And Russia's objective of trying to bring down competition from the U.S. The U.S. was able to increase its production. These are the shale producers, from about 9 million barrels per day to about 30 million barrels a day for the last 4 years. And collectively, over the last 15 years or almost 15 years, we're able to raise U.S. oil production for about 4.5 million barrels to about 13 million at the peak. And that happened in an environment of higher oil prices. So Russia's objective as a large producer is obviously to knock down the price, and therefore the two parties, Saudi Arabia and Russia, I think, are on the same wavelength as far as the final objective is concerned. Sorry to take more time than I had intended.
Oh, that's okay. Thank you, Dr. Findakly, for the excellent overview. And so now we will move to Rachel Ziemba. And in her remarks, she will place the Gulf's local bond equity and direct investment in a global context. And she will look into the fiscal challenges and the sort of stimulus packages that are materializing to address some of the points on the support to banks and financial institutions and how that affects the fiscal and broader situation. Rachel?
Thanks, Dania, and thanks to all of you for joining today. I will, do my best to cover those broad, sort of broad topics, and look forward to taking specific questions in the Q&A and learning from the rest of the panelists. So I thought I'd start by highlighting a few common trends across the 6 countries in the GCC. And then highlight some of the divergences, which Dania and Dr. Findakly, both sort of highlighted in their remarks. So what we're facing right now is really interlinked health, economic, and financial crises around the global economy. For the Gulf, the reduction in oil and gas revenues is, of course, the major financial hit. But this crisis, unlike past shocks, is really one in which the non-oil economy is also impacted very substantially. And as in 2008, you also have a hit to oil revenues at the same time as there's a hit to investment revenue via those countries that have sizable sovereign funds. So you have many shocks happening at the same time. And in this broader context, the balance sheets look weaker than they did in 2014, and in some cases 2018, or even 2011, which was a time of big stimulus during the Arab Spring. And so as a result, you've actually seen a more moderate policy response in the Gulf than you have in either of those three previous shocks that have been experienced over the last decade and a half. And in that way, I think the Gulf has, in the early phases of response, looked more like some emerging markets as opposed to developed market peers. Those metrics may not be incredibly useful because, of course, the Gulf, due to its dollar pegs, something we can come back to, has been able to ease interest rates, follow the Fed downwards. It also, some countries can borrow more cheaply. But this was not unlike some of the big developed economies that have been rolling out large fiscal stimulus plans. The policy response was initially credit-oriented. As Dania mentioned, elements of quantitative easing, but more than that, really liquidity measures to help keep the banks flowing, help avoid them pulling back from the businesses in the sector. The challenge, though, for the Gulf is that just doing credit measures is not enough. We know that small and medium-sized enterprises struggle to have a small portion of outstanding loans. And at the heart of this around the world is an issue of how to put the economy on pause in a way that it can be revived later when we've hopefully vanquished or brought into some stabilization the health crisis. So we've seen over the last week, really, a number of countries starting to come up with new ways of supporting labor markets. In the Gulf, that means ways of supporting labor markets of nationals. And I'm sure other panelists can come back to that. So across the board, where the oil price drop, the oil demand drop, something I'm sure Jean-François is going to talk about in more detail than I, have really put a pressure on all countries. All of the countries run a fiscal deficit with oil at $30. All of the countries are also facing challenges to non-oil revenues. But of course, this is where the sort of divergences come into play. The amount of savings available to cope with these shocks varies dramatically across the region. We know that the smaller, richer countries, Qatar, Kuwait, the UAE, have much more financial resources than peers like particularly Oman and Bahrain. Oman in particular is a country that we were already worried about debt sustainability, even with oil prices that were much higher. Those, of course, have become much more acute. So while all countries face a challenge of do they cut spending and reinforce the downturn? Do they borrow more debt, which has been the financing choice over the last few years? Or do they draw down their existing assets? These are all choices that I think will reinforce some of the economic inequalities within the region and probably within countries, particularly some of the larger countries like Saudi Arabia. I want to make sure to talk a little bit about the region's sovereign funds. It's early to say exactly what they will do and what they will be asked to do. And of course, those of you who know the region and know the region's sovereign funds know that they themselves are very diverse. We have development funds who have a local investment mandate. We have investment funds whose goal is to invest quite broadly across asset markets and provide a stream of capital. And of course, we have segments of funds as well as the assets managed by central banks that are really there to be available for a rainy day. And as the Prime Minister of Canada has highlighted in the last few days, that it's raining, right? This is a time to use some of those rainy day funds. So I wouldn't necessarily see drawdown of some of those reserve assets as necessarily a source of concern, but people will be watching that closely on the credit market side. So I do anticipate sovereign funds will clearly be investing less abroad. There is not new capital coming in. Some of them didn't have much new capital in the last few years. We saw some of the biggest new capital was really just a reallocation of funds between different entities within Saudi Arabia, for example. But I expect that we'll see the more development-oriented sovereign investors, those with a local investment mandate like Mubadala, even the Public Investment Fund and other vehicles being expected to invest more at home. Decisions on big projects will vary and how much they're expected to do that. We might also see more co-investment, partnering with other pools of capital globally. And I do think we will see reserve funds to some extent drawn down and depleted. This economic and financial diversity is of course going to drive what countries, what entities have market access. We saw yesterday Qatar going to the market, issuing $10 billion in bonds fairly easily. The interest rate was meaningfully higher than it would have been a few months ago, but still quite manageable and attractive. Some people would ask, why would they do that given the ample assets in the Qatar Investment Authority? Well, one is that a large amount of those assets are not liquid. Two, if the return of the cost of capital, the cost of finance is lower than what they hope will be the returns, it makes sense. And I think the other reason was that they wanted to issue to show that they could issue. And I expect we might see others in that context. Of course, Oman in particular, and even Bahrain, which may benefit from more and will need more regional support, are going to pay a much higher premium and cost if they want to maintain market access. And that's going to be a real question. There's some important maturities coming up, not only for Oman, but also for some of the regional state-owned enterprises that are going to be important to watch. So again, I'm going to stop here because I think I've outrun my time, but just to sort of, conclude in saying that this is going to be a tough time economically for the countries in the Gulf. The balance sheets, there are still resources to be drawn upon, but in drawing upon those, we will see greater. We face a couple of concerns. One, even greater government involvement in the economy, which may make it harder for the private sector. And a broader challenge that may make it even harder to coordinate across the region, given some of those financial diversities. I'm going to stop there and look forward to taking your questions and hearing from the rest of the panel.
So next we will have Dr. Jean-François Seznec.
Well, thank you very much, Dania. One thing that struck me yesterday was that Bloomberg stated that the COVID-19 crisis may actually kill demand for crude oil by up to 35 million barrels per day. Now, that may be exaggerated. Other sources have mentioned 18 million barrels a day, but that also means that it will be very difficult for Russia and Saudi Arabia to come up with some kind of a plan that will cut enough production to reach those levels and change the prices. On top of it, the storage facilities worldwide are totally full. A small factor, if you like, to show that is that the tankers are used as one of the main storage area nowadays because everything else is pretty full. The cost of a daily tanker went from $40,000 to $200,000 a day right now. So we're talking about a big problem, and I somewhat doubt that the meetings tomorrow will come up with enough of a cut to make a difference. Now, they all, on top of it, the Saudi Arabia and Russia are perfectly happy to take some cuts if the US also takes some cuts. And the US, technically speaking, cannot decide to take cuts. On the other hand, de facto, they are cutting because the companies will go bankrupt at $20 per barrel. Now, if the prices go below that, many companies will disappear totally, but it won't happen overnight. because most of the companies have sunk the money in the wells, and it's going to take some time for the wells to get shut down, because as long as they can produce even a barrel of oil, the money can help them stay out of bankruptcy because they can pay the banks. Sooner or later, they will go into bankruptcy, but it may take a year to reach that level. In the meantime, what can the Saudis and the Russians cut? Maybe 3 million barrels each, maybe 4 million barrels each. We have no idea. We'll see. Maybe they'll be very, very aggressive and cut 5 million barrels a day each. But again, the Saudis will want to make sure that the Russians abide by this. And of course, the Russians have never abided by those cuts in the past. So this time they may actually have to do it. But I'm not terribly optimistic that the cuts will happen. But if they do happen, I'm not optimistic that it will make a major difference on the prices either. So I think that the demand will remain very, very low during this coming recession that we're having. And the recession, in my personal opinion, will be much deeper than we've seen in the past. There are some people who've mentioned on the internet that we should be talking about a depression, which I pray we don't get to. But anyway, a very strong recession which will cut demand. Now, if that's the case, it means that the countries of the Gulf will have to reevaluate their plans very quickly. Rachel mentioned what happened in Qatar, where they just issued some bonds. I think Qatar is an interesting situation because what can they do? The Qatar Investment Authority, which is of course extremely opaque and never tells us any of what they're doing, but if they had the choice of selling today to raise cash for Qatar, they would take an enormous amount of losses because all their investments are in real estate, in owning companies or owning shares in the markets, and those would really force them to take some major losses. So if you take a 30 or 40% loss on $350 billion, you're talking real money. So their choice at this point is to borrow money, but borrowing the type of money they want is still not enough. So they may have to cut projects. And yesterday they have announced that they would cut their LNG plans, the increase in 50% of their LNG capacity, which they had to do anyway because there's no market for their LNG at this point for the near future. But they also may have to look and bite the bullet and consider cutting a lot of the projects for the 2022 World Cup, which will be a major loss of face, of course, for Qatar. So Qatar has to make some really tough decisions at this point. In Saudi Arabia has a little bit of an advantage, and it's not much of an advantage in the sense that their assets are mostly held in cash. I mean, the central bank of Saudi Arabia has between $450 to $500 billion in very short-term investments, which allows them to see the figures which Dr. Findakly mentioned of 150, $160 billion deficit. It gives them and I agree with those figures, by the way, Hani. I think they're perfect on the spot. I think they can last for a little bit, but nevertheless, Saudi Arabia has to change its approach. And I think that's a key in what we may see in the near future, because moving money into projects like NEOM or Amwala and very large tourism developments, when tourists are not going to come for the near future to Saudi Arabia, would be a complete waste of money. So I think a lot of the Vision 2030 projects may go away. And they will go back to what we were doing in the past, which is using the low-cost carbon molecules to go into very advanced chemicals where there's a lot of value added. And basically turning a little bit Saudi Arabia into a sort of a Germany of the 1930s, if you're 1910s really, and where they would develop according to their natural advantage of low-cost carbon molecules. So we may see that. I think the UAE is an interesting situation because the UAE, we should divide Abu Dhabi from Dubai in this case, because Abu Dhabi, a little bit like Qatar Investment Authority, is highly liquid in the sense that the investments of ADIA And again, we don't really know what the DIA is investing in, but sort of. And they could start losing a great deal of money if they start selling the assets. So I've just heard that they are planning to put bonds of 10 billion and for bonds for 5 years and 10 years and 20 years. And that would really help them with their liquidity. But I think a lot of their projects, again, have to be abandoned. They already dropped the sour gas projects, and they dropped the increasing capacity to 4 million barrels a day. They may have to cut projects like all these fancy projects to create a new financial center in Abu Dhabi, etc., just to compete with Dubai, or the Khalifa port to compete with Jebel Ali. So I think we will see a lot of changes there, and I'm not sure where Abu Dhabi is going to take this, but in a way it's positive for Dubai, because I think Dubai will have less competition from Abu Dhabi, but also Dubai seems to always do well when there are crises somewhere in the world, and okay, they have to delay the world fair of 2020, but they will have some issues, but they also will have some great advantages. So of course, I'm much more concerned about countries like Bahrain or Oman, as has been mentioned. But nevertheless, I think that in the Gulf, at any rate, I think Qatar will suffer perhaps more than everybody else. That may be a positive in some ways, because it may force the Saudis, who also have some problems, and the Qataris to get back together a little bit. And it's better to be together than against each other in a big crisis of this nature, which I think is beyond any of the disagreements there may be. So this is really what I just wanted to mention, and I think I'll just leave it to questions in the future and leave time to hear Dr. Jasim to see what he has to say.
Thank you, Dr. Seznec. So now we will proceed on to Dr. Husain, who will be discussing the fiscal stimulus packages launched by the GCC governments and how these stimulus packages will affect the private sector. Dr. Husain?
Thank you very much. This is Jasim from Bahrain. Really the total value of the combined total value of all the stimulus packages and relief at the moment stands around $150 billion. And the figure is on the rise. So this is something very, really very special. Really. What is really, and all the countries have something in common now, really focusing on providing relief in the financial services sector, offering, soft loans, delaying installments of loans up to 6 months. So this is something now common throughout the Gulf. But I must say, really, Bahrain stands out, despite the fact that Bahrain is this, the smallest really, economy, but the authorities have gone way, really gone really out of their way in offering support. I learned really of a really parliamentary delegation visiting the Crown Prince of Bahrain. The Crown Prince has told them really that we have to put this idea of fiscal balancing on hold now. What matters at the moment is ensuring that the public is pleased, the business community has no problem. So confidence matters really. Deficit also can be handled at a later stage, which is something really quite shocking, really, that really had really. Now, in some details. Bahrain now, the government is offering the Bahraini nationals who work in the private sector. The government will be paying their salaries for 3 months, April, May, and June. It's only for the locals. That's one thing. The other thing, really, the government is also providing, paying the bills for utilities for 3 months, April, May, June. The government will pay the bills really, but up to the same amount really households use in 2019. But this is something very good. The idea is to encourage people to stay home, and really this is really coming up very soon, because the month of Ramadan is coming up very soon. So authorities really, feel they have to do this really. This is something. The other thing really, banks, have been instructed by the central bank to defer all loans payments for 6 months without any extra interest or fees added. Those who do not wish to receive, they have to tell the banks that they do not want to, they want to continue paying. The idea is to make sure that people have enough liquidity with them so then they can spend and they feel secure and pleased. Not just banks, really, even credit card companies have been instructed instructed to delay receiving all the minimum amounts people have to pay for 6 months. So people can delay, they don't have to pay the credit card companies for 6 months, again, with no interest and no fees added, really. So this is something really, quite especially, and the list keeps going on. We always see new things, business communities getting their own, idea of 6 months, they don't have to pay the loans, really. So a lot of really different kinds of financial support is really coming out for the people. So the authorities feel what matters now is ensuring that people are pleased, people are happy, and the business community is pleased that, so they are so careful really. But there's also a good amount of money, given for the central bank to allow for delay of loans and also, so a lot of money really is there. But that's really. Saudi Arabia, they had 2 tranches of packages. The value is now $32 billion. The focus is on one thing is to allow banks to delay receiving or requesting the installments of the loans for up to 6 months. The other thing is giving the SMEs the opportunity to delay providing the VAT to the government, not paying the fees for 6 months, and that also not requiring payment of fees for entry and exit of expatriates. So something very special really. So Saudi really has $32 billion. Bahrain has about, it's 11 plus billion, but keeps adding. The UAE, now is the biggest so far. They have now $70 billion. But most of the focus is on really the financial services sector. Reducing the reserves that banks have to hold with the central bank, so then they can free the amounts for lending. All these buffers also really reduce. But they keep finding new ways, just to inject really money into the economy. But really, there is no financial support. It's mostly through the banking industry, really. The other thing is really support for the stock markets, because the stock markets have really fallen sharply. The Dubai stock market has really plunged by 36% in the first quarter of 2020. This is the highest, within the Gulf. So the UAE authorities feel they have to do something about that. This is really something. Oman, speaking of Oman has also allocated $21 billion. But again, primarily through providing support for the financial institutions. So then they don't have to take loans back from individuals and companies, which really need support. So Oman is providing the least. It's not across the board. Only the hardest hit, the ones that are bad, they badly need to not to pay the loans, they can delay really. But Oman really is not in a position now to provide financial support. This new sultan really assumed the power at the most difficult time, really. Drop in oil prices, drop in business activity, a lot of things really. So Oman is in a very difficult situation. We have heard that we're expecting a new package that would affect the people really, directly. But at the moment, the focus really. We also notice really some of the rating agencies are not happy. Really, they are reducing the rating for Oman. S&P did that. Really, they think really this idea of delaying the installments could undermine the quality of assets in the banking industry. So, in fact, Oman has the worst outlook within the GCC. It's very serious for them. So, Oman is in a very difficult position. Really. Kuwait, we have not seen really specific financial figures. Most of the focus in Kuwait again is on the banking industry, reducing the reserves, allowing banks to increase the capacity of their lending to households and individuals. So they just feel they have to make sure that there is enough liquidity in the market. Businesses can rely on the banks for their for business activity. So this is something Kuwait has been doing. Qatar really is has done a very amazing job really of managing to raise $10 billion. We could see other Gulf countries following suit. In fact, Qatar is the leader in that really. So to be able to raise funds at this difficult time. Bahrain was hoping to raise more than $1 billion, but it was put on hold. They felt the market is not safe at the moment. Really, investors were looking very, very high interest rates, something we could not afford. So that was put on hold. But Qatar really, really did make it really. The other thing Qatar has done is really again the idea of they put this $23 billion package really, allowing the central bank to let the banks in Qatar to delay this idea of this loan installments, soft loans, support for the stock market. So essentially, but so really I must really go back to this. Of all the 6 countries, Bahrain has been providing specific support to the people, salaries, electricity, and stuff like that, so people can feel the benefits, of that really. I must say really, just looking forward, I think the sad part is all of this support is going for the locals, the nationals, but not the expats. What we need is ensure that support also goes for the expats. A good number of expats are suffering sadly really. They are suffering from loss of jobs. Some are not even able to go back to their countries, because there are no flights, to travel back like to Egypt or to Pakistan or to India. All these supports are going for the locals, and I hope really the authorities would do something, because the expats are so important for the local economies. This is the time to really to pay back the dues and all the good things they have done, to the country. There are a lot of things, possibly we can discuss them during the Q&A. Thank you.
I'm afraid we're running out of time. Obviously, this is a very interesting topic, given the current situation that the GCC economies are facing and the global economy as well. I would like to thank all of you for sharing this excellent discussion with us and our audience, which I know may seem invisible, but they are there. And for everyone, please, you can follow our work by subscribing to our newsletter, visiting our websites, follow us on Twitter, and keep a lookout for our virtual events. The next one will be on Yemen next week. Please stay safe and healthy. Take good care. And goodbye for now. Hopefully we'll all be in touch virtually. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you.
Thank you all. Thank you.
Thank you, Dania. Thank all of you.
Thank you.